So basically, the idea now is to continue working with the final results of MyPEX, and also to share with you some of the recommendations that we have found with the final result of the projects. Our idea is basically to after the end of the event, to have some recommendation that we can use for the European Union policies, or at least to have some final recommendation. And we would like to ask you if we can do an exercise all together in this issue. So I would like to start talking about the specific recommendation. All these recommendations are coming from the national partners. As you know, we have 38 countries. Here are the recommendations that are more or less coming from the European Union, the 28 countries. So I start with the specific recommendations are coming from the national partners, and then Thomas will continue with some general recommendation for the European Union that also is coming from the national partners. I would like just to read, to remember, because I think that some of you have received the policy brief that Thomas and me have drafted. So basically, just a quick reading of all of them. We would like to start saying that it's necessary to promote effective general and targeted work-based training and qualification and skill recognition programs with a specific attention for men and women and non-EU training versus low educated. As a second recommendation, we would like to mention that it's necessary to increase uptake of social rights and general support for non-EU citizens after evaluation of single resident and work permit. Increase their family reunion rate, especially for citizens from conflict countries, by reviewing practices, statistics, and evaluation, and then challenging any legal or practical obstacle to the right to family reunion. The fourth recommendation, increase the share of EU long-term residents among all with 5+ years legal stay by reviewing and challenging any legal or practical obstacles and informing potential beneficiaries, especially again with beneficiaries of international protection. Collect better data on discrimination victims' access to justice in court and alternative dispute mechanisms, like for example complaint, case and sanction by ground and area. Increase discrimination reporting rates by stressing the mechanisms, training, and tools to fight discrimination through the law. Empower equality bodies and NGOs, and promote equality through binding state commitments. Review and remedy gaps in education entitlements, and develop models and tools address the specific needs and opportunity brought by immigrants' populations. Review and remedy gaps in healthcare entitlements and information obligation for all non-EU citizens, and development standard and training models on integration competency for health service providers. And finally, propose, monitor, and inform member states on initiatives to remedy democratic deficit through access to nationality, voting rights, and/or innovative new approaches. Thomas?
Yeah, and so overall, this could be addressed in the future EU migration action plan by trying to see how a more comprehensive integration strategy could be developed with specific commitments coming from all of the DGs of the Commission, and also working on how to properly evaluate integration spending and support that's EU funded, particularly when we come to possible relocation or resettlement. Trying to bring in more of these evaluation, evidence-based approach when EU money is used on integration issues, making sure that then different countries know about the EU data that's available on integration, and making sure that it fully covers all areas of integration and is relevant from an integration policy perspective. So making sure that some of these integration indicators that we're talking about are much more focused on where integration policies actually are able to reach people. And then beyond that, looking at how the EU can better support immigrant-run civil society to become more active, not just in meetings of the Migration Forum, but to be better organized at the European level. The same goes with trying to come up with a more structural cooperation with local and regional authorities on how EU funds can be used on integration, and also about how immigrants can access and be informed of their rights. So as Elena was saying, these recommendations, they come from us knowing what the EU is able or is not able to do. We looked at what our national partners were recommending at the national level, and you can read on each country profile, actually, where the different partners used the MIPEX results to come up with some recommendations. So some of these recommendations are more or less relevant for certain countries. And again, we tried to really focus it on what the EU can and cannot do. So that's where now we wanted to turn to our three speakers in the high-level panel. Diana from DG Education and Culture could not join us for childcare reasons, but we are very privileged to be joined by Ulrika Lunacek from the European Parliament, and then by two colleagues from the European Commission, Isabel de la Mota from DG Health, and then Laura Corrado from DG Home, the coordinating unit on integration. And so, we just wanted to have more of the informal reactions of our panelists to the recommendations or to the results that we've sent around. What does the Who Benefits project basically tell you based on what you're seeing? What do you think, in a broad question, what do you think the EU can or cannot do to try and make policies more ambitious, more effective at the national level based on the areas that you are most interested in? So perhaps first I'll turn to Ms. Ulrika Lunacek from the Parliament, Vice President, coming originally from Austria, but very knowledgeable also on the current EU debates on migration. First, your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, and also thank you for inviting me, and I find it a very interesting debate, also your results. And I have to admit, being from Austria, I was specifically interested of the results from my home country, but that's not what the debate is about now, although partially it is. So as far as what your recommendations are good, I mean, I personally can sign up to all of them. The question is, how do we get to them? How do we implement them? And I'd like to specifically comment on those that have to do with democracy and inclusiveness on the democratic part, because in so many member states we have lots of citizens living in cities, in regions, in the countries without having voting rights, without being able to accede to becoming citizens or having double citizenship, because that's also a topic very disputed in many countries. Some do it quite right easily, but others simply say, no, you have to decide which one you belong to. And that I find is something very critical in times when people live and work very often in different countries, yeah, or live part of their lives in one, another one in another one. So it should be something in modern times rather easy, especially also inside the European Union, to have double citizenship. And the issue with voting rights also, and I think you're very right to demand that, because I think the issue should be to have voting rights according to where you live and not according to where you were born. Yeah? Because especially at local and regional level, yeah? This is also for national level as well. But I find people should have a say in where they live and not just in where they come from. Maybe in both, yeah. But so these kind of voting rights are important. Having the access to citizenship and make that easy, I think it's part of your recommendations as well. I think in general the problems in many countries of having and what we see now also with this refugee crisis, we see that there are no really good legal ways for people to migrate to the European Union. Yeah? We don't have a kind of European Union migration scheme. Yeah? We don't have a common asylum scheme either. Yeah? So this is the difficulties I think we have in not having a union which really is a union on these issues. Yeah? I mean, don't have the whole thing about quota and so on. Yeah? I think it's really that for refugees, it is really an issue where the European Union should be stronger and should really cooperate. And it's a structural problem with member states. We had the former Commissioner Malmström. She was rather strong on that, yeah, and she wanted to increase the possibility of people to migrate to the European Union in legal ways, yeah, in regular ways. Sort of see, okay, who wants to come? What can he or she expect? What do we want? Yeah, and all of that. But member states simply didn't help. So I think that is one important part as well. Then another one, for me, that's very important ones. The other ones I wanted to tell you what in the European Parliament we had the last. Legally we. As you know, the Parliament since 2009 is co-legislator on many issues. Or for example, we were co-legislator on the Dublin II, Dublin III system. But on integration, there is no real European Union legislation. Yeah? It's member states issue. But we did in 2013, that was the last real resolution, sort of a will of the Parliament without any legislative power. We did one on integration of migrants, its effect on the labor market, and the external dimension of social security coordination. And there we had some very strong statements in how important it would be, and you had that in part of your recommendations as well, to develop education and communication programs to inform migrant women of their rights and responsibilities, and to specifically focus on multilingual counseling service for women. And also, I think that's a point in quite a few member states where that we need a legal framework guaranteeing immigrant women the right to hold their own passport. Some member states still do not allow women if they get residence permits because of their husbands. Yeah? In case they want to get a divorce, because in case of maybe domestic violence, they don't have the right, even if they have lived in the country for a long while, to get their own passports and their own citizenship, but they have to return to wherever they came from, I don't know how many years ago. So that is an issue we also had in the European Parliament at that time. And in general, sort of do campaigns in order to increase the participation of migrant women in democratic life, and to have more exchange platforms for migrant women. So I would like for the beginning to leave it here, and then listen to colleagues.
Okay, I'll come back to you to ask more what you think the EU can also do in some of these domains, but you highlighted drawing attention to certain issues, making certain types of recommendations. Absolutely. Isabel Danamota, working in health, could you give us some idea of what kinds of trends you're seeing in the member states? Where are your priorities on migrant health, so we can see how the MIPEX results compare to where the Commission thinks things are going or thinks things should be going?
The European Union began to work on migrants' health in 2009 with the communication on health inequalities, solidarity in health. And since that moment, it has been a continuing that is, of course, biased by the fact that the treaty and the Charter of Fundamental Rights said what they said regarding the access to healthcare for everybody. That depends of the legislation in the member states. So there is no united position on the EU member state regarding the access to healthcare for regular, irregular. The only thing that is common is the access by asylum seekers. And the children, that is not doesn't come from EU legislation, but from the Convention of the Rights of the Children. That makes that the access to the children to healthcare and antenatal delivery and postnatal care has to be provided to everybody in the same conditions. For asylum seeker, also the healthcare has to be provided as for the nationals. But for the rest of migrant, regular, irregular, whatever, the situation that depends of the decision of the member state. Point. And so we have several projects that we have been working on. One of them is the Equi-Health, that you know because it's part of this one. And the other one that is completely in line with the recommendation and what David presented, that is the training of the health professionals that are not dealing in a regular basis with with migrants, but to improve their knowledge and the attitudes towards migrants and the minorities. This is something that began like 1 year ago, so that fits completely well with your recommendation. The Commission has been discussing the issue of migrants' health in several occasions. The last one was in the EBSCO Council, the Minister of Health Council last week. And here the position is more or less common. I mean that we have to differentiate the short and the medium long-term way. For the short term, I mean the influx of irregular migrants that are arriving or asylum seekers just now, they don't have health problems. They are not a problem for the health security of the citizens in the European Union. They come exhausted, they are pregnant women, they are children that we have to check if they are in good health and vaccinated. They have survived a long trip, but they are not bringing diseases to the European Union. So we have to cope with their situation now, and that's all. Many of the issues arrive when they stay already in the European Union and they don't have work, they don't have money, they don't have education, they don't have food, and then they are in the situation of all the deprived population. And we all know that health conditions are related with education and with the economic conditions. So maybe we should focus on that situation. So what we are going to do with the migrants that are in the European Union. And it's not an issue of providing more rights or a specific right. It's just the issue of they will have the same right that the rest of the residents in the European Union, and we will have to focus on that. But as I have said, we are trying to work with the member states, but at the end, it's the responsibility of the member states.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you because you mentioned also other policy areas related to health, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But then, Laura Corrado, your unit oversees on legal migration and integration, these developments. So I wondered what the results were saying to you based on what you're seeing as member states' priorities on these issues now, or the trends that you're seeing, and then how your unit tries to respond and deal with, EU law making more effective, and the funds and future developments.
Yes, thanks very much. Good afternoon. Well, first of all, I think the first reaction is that, we are quite glad to see that there are some improvements in the index, and that it's also due, partly at least, to implementation of EU law, and I think also to the funding that we have provided to several member states that have developed entirely new strategy on integration. Some member states didn't have this prior to that. So I think even if we don't have, it is true, we don't have hard law powers in the area of integration, but I think we have done a lot in the past years to, first of all, with the funding and the European Integration Fund, and now the Asylum Migration Integration Fund. The Social Fund, by the way, has also contributed a lot, because also actions and measures that target migrants can be funded also under the European Social Fund. And we are working with the colleagues in DG Employment to try to maximize the synergies in the using of funds, both at the programming stage and also in the implementation at national level, because most of these funding are managed at national level by the authority. So trying to see how they can, they have an obligation to ensure complementarity and synergy. So we are working with the colleagues in DG Employment especially, but there are also, of course, also the regional funds concerned to improve that. We have done, of course, a lot in terms also of, we have a network of national contact points on integration. We have a website on integration with maps of interactive practices. So we have done a lot also to spread the good practices, and we will continue to work in that direction. Now, in the follow-up to the European Agenda on Migration that was adopted in May, which stated that we need to have a more global, holistic approach on migration and integration, and ensure more and more synergies. I think we are now reflecting how to do that in practice. Do we create structures that would mainstream integration further within the Commission or not? This is under reflection at the moment, but certainly we will continue to use and develop the tools that we already have in this area, that's for sure. But we will need to see a bit how we do that. And Another thing that I wanted to say is that, of course, I mean, this is very important, and clearly it's no surprise to us that, for example, Sweden ranks first, or Portugal and the other member states, because they have developed, also because they have welcomed more and more migrants, and particular refugees. As regards Sweden, they have developed a very, let's say, fully fledged strategies, and have invested in integration. It is also to be borne in mind, and that's, I think, where we can make the link with what we developed, the Zaragoza indicators, that, of course, if we take still Sweden, it's also the country where you have the highest gaps between, for example, labor market participation of natives and of migrants. So I think we have to consider all these elements to have the broader picture of integration in one country, what it works and why, and so on. So I think this is very important for us to have a very broad picture on integration, all the elements that make a successful or less successful integration policy in member states. Maybe I react on some of the recommendations that are more relevant for us. But first, I wanted maybe to link to what my colleague said on the access to healthcare. I also wanted to add that, however, it is true that the access to the healthcare, social security remains national, but we do have also a key in the area of legal migration, not only asylum, which provides for equal treatment for migrants, at least those covered under our directive. So it means that they must have access, including to social security and health benefits on the ground of equal treatment. Then, of course, each member state defines its own social security system, the benefits that are granted, but we do have some protections also for legal migrants, not only asylum seekers. So I think this is important to bear in mind. As regards your recommendation, I think I have somehow responded on the more comprehensive integration strategies. Yes, that's what we will try to do and continue to do, trying to put together all the different areas that contribute to the success of integration policy and support member states' policies and measures in this area, including on the funding. I think I mentioned already about the synergies and complementarity in funding. On the expand the Zaragoza indicators, I profit to mention that on Thursday there will be the publication of a study that we have done jointly with the OECD on integration indicators, so more outcome indicators, which will be very interesting, and I think it's also complementary to this work that you have been carried out. On the content support from the civil society, yes, as you know, because you were involved, we have already in the Migration Forum, which used to be the Integration Forum, now transformed into the Migration Forum. We have tried to involve more and more civil society, and including the grassroots organization, and it's something that we want to develop further, so that we can have a dialogue, more structural dialogue with the civil society on integration issues, because it's the people that work on the ground that can tell us what works, what doesn't work, and including the local authorities. On the qualification and skills, I have attended this morning a seminar on the recognition of qualifications skills, which our colleagues in DG Employment organized with us, with DG Grow, DG AC, and one of the panels was on how to work to improve the recognition of qualifications and skills of third country national, because this is one of the biggest issues for an effective integration, labor market integration, but not only. And certainly we are a bit exploring what we can do, starting from what we have already, some tools that we have. For example, the European Qualification Framework, which is not a tool for recognition, but that can facilitate the comparison, the referencing of qualifications, and then lead to facilitated and more rapid recognition procedures. We had presentation, for example, from Germany, I think also Austria, that have introduced recently legislation to facilitate the recognition of qualification, for example, by providing for an evaluation and assessment prior to arrival, and which somehow can serve as a benchmark for the future, also for other countries. So that I think that's something where we need to work and where we want to work further. On the other aspects concerning the single permit, the long-term residence directive, the family reunification directives, we are now in the process of announcing the enforcement of this directive on the long-term residence. We have actually a lot of complaints, and maybe they don't reach a public stage of infringements, but there are a lot of issues that are solved when they remain only at the complaint stage, where we raise issues with member states, discuss them, and they have changed legislation very often also to, we know that there are still problems for the long-term residents, for the family reunification, but I mean, there have been steps that have been made, maybe not too visible, because of course until we really go to court it's less visible, but that we are somehow stepping the enforcement of this, and we are also doing that for the single permit, even if it's a more recent directive. But of course these are very important in terms of rights for the country national, not only in terms of admission procedures. So I think most of the recommendations that were addressed to us, to the Commission, and in particular to DG Home, I addressed, but I'm happy to further discuss.
I'd be interested to talk also about the comprehensive and mainstreaming part of integration. But I don't want to privilege the microphone, so I want to ask also in the room, do you have particular questions that you would like to ask to any of our three panelists about what the EU is or could be doing? Do you also have comments that you want to make about MIPEX results or about understanding how you can use them before we go into the more interactive part of today? So, I turn over to the room. Yes. All right, let's see if this other microphone now works. Can you try that one, Francesc? Does that work?
It should be now. Can you try it?
Thank you. Lilana Keith from PICUM. It's the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants. Just on the health aspect, I very much appreciated the input from Isabel de la Mata. But I was just wondering if I could ask you for a bit more on where you were saying the Convention on the Rights of the Child was really the framework which you were using for asylum seekers. Okay, I misunderstood because you were talking about the asylum receptions.
No, I said
law.
that the only legislation that that cover some populations on health are asylum seekers and the conventions of the rights of the children for access to healthcare, but they are completely separate things.
Indeed. But so do you see some more potential for how we could use that legislation also for irregular migrants? Because that's something that we've, for undocumented migrants, access to healthcare as well. It's something that we've been reaching out consistently to the Commission and to Member States around their duties under the Convention on the Rights of the Child for undocumented children's access to healthcare. And just as you mentioned it in your intervention, I was wondering if you could comment if you see some potential also from the Commission side to push that, even though it is mostly Member State competence for health.
It's competence of the member states. We don't have competence in health in the member states at all. To follow the convention of the children's rights is the DG Home, DG Justice, who is home. I don't know which. Yeah. It's, I mean, it's. But in any case, it's not because of EU legislation and in health. No, so we cannot follow that. We talk sometimes with the member state when we have the information, the ones that are not respected that, and the access to children and pregnant women and the delivery and the postnatal care to health, and also for the irregular migrants, the access to emergency care, healthcare. But apart from that, we cannot do anything because it's clear in the treaty, in the Article 168, but also in the Charter of Fundamental Rights that is quoted by many people, forgetting the end of the sentence, that is the competence of the member state. Apart from that, we don't see, we have tried, we will continue to try, but we don't see any possibility of enlarging that because we don't have the legal competence for that.
And then to G-Home?
Yes, maybe just to mention that in the Return Directive we do, because we are talking about irregular migrants, so we do have provisions, at least as regard access to emergency healthcare, and of course there are protective provisions as regard children and right not to be separated by family and so on. So of course, it's a very sensitive issue, and it's true in general as regards irregular migrants and rights of irregular migrants. It's very, very tricky. Also legally, we have something that is covered by the Return Directive, as I mentioned, in the asylum directives, but those are not irregular migrants, of course. I mentioned equal treatment in the Legal Migration Directive, but it's really an area, a tricky area. So, for the moment, that's what we can say.
All right. Who else in the room? Yes.
Hi, I'm Frank from Doctors of the World medical NGO, and actually my question is not health related, but on the other policy strands, and it's towards actually the MIPEX researchers. First of all, congratulations for this great overall work. When we're going to go and see policymakers on a national level and try and advance migrants' rights to healthcare, then the first obstacle in terms of policy is this fear that more access to healthcare will draw in more migrants to Europe. Now we have data of an increasingly scientific level that proves that this is not true, at least not for the destitute migrants that we see in the field. But I can imagine that in terms of the other policy strands, that this will be the #1 fear of member states, no? That more integration opportunities will mean a pull effect and even more irregular migration and what have you. How do you see that? Do you see, do the MIPEX indicators offer some, reassurance for member states? I mean, I intuitively think that this is not true, but how do you feel about that as a researcher? And because this will be the #1 fear of national governments, won't it?
Well, from my perspective, I wouldn't say that these opportunities in themselves are pull factors. I think that they are, though, related to immigration. I mean, for people to be able to reunite with their family does involve, in part, the immigration of the family members. But it equally involves the integration of the sponsor, who now has a perspective in the country, and then the integration possibilities of those children and the family members. In other areas, we talk about the stability of residence, that it allows people eventually to settle long-term, to become citizens. It allows them to have equal opportunities in different areas, although that very much depends on their legal status. And I do see that in certain countries, for example, right now the UK, most of this discussion about integration has been turned to a discussion just about immigration, and where everything is seen as maybe this will have a potential impact on immigration, whereas then all of the effects on integration, which is probably the preponderance of effects, are ignored. So I do think that the two happen in common. You see countries of immigration that tend to offer more integration possibilities, but we all know that that's not actually what determines whether someone will immigrate to a country. Immigration is not such a free choice, and whether someone reunites with their family depends on where their family is, and whether they stabilize in the country depends on getting a legal status to get there in the first place. But it is part of being a country of immigration, and there are certainly a few countries that you see from our data, like, let's say, Cyprus, where there is absolutely no desire to remain as a country of immigration, and rather just to be a country of temporary migration, regardless of the effects that has. Whereas countries eventually, like Malta nowadays, is changing its mind and is starting to talk about integration, realizing that these people are staying on the island and that they are not going to leave. So I do think it's very risky if our discussion becomes only about immigration, because I think we inflate a lot of the potential effects of these policies on immigration, and we forget what these policies are there for and why they work.
Thanks.
Are there other questions also for the panelists about what the EU could be doing? If not, I wanted to then go myself to Ms. Lunacek, because you seemed actually quite dismal about what the EU in itself could be doing, what the European Parliament could be doing. Maybe you had some reactions on that. And then for the other two panelists, I wanted to briefly hear, you both talked about other policy areas. So I'd be interested in what other policy areas that we look like in MIPEX you think are really important for developing strong integration policies or for responding to health, just so we could get an idea of what a comprehensive integration policy would look like. So just very briefly, 1 or 2 words.
Well, for me, yes, as I said before, I mean, having been now member of the European Parliament for 6 years and before 10 years in the Austrian National Parliament, and looking into what is being done at national, at member state level, and what the EU is doing, I find really the EU in that effect not having simply much say, yeah, and not member states not being willing to have the EU have a bigger say, yeah? When we come to what I said before, migration and asylum policy. That, of course, integration is something different, but there also it's member states' competence. So the bit what can be done by EU institutions is to push and to try here and to use this directive and the next one, another one, to get something moving forward. So that is my principal criticism of the way that we always have to find certain ways as European Union in order to push member states to do something, yeah? And I very much I joined this meeting just when I think you were speaking on these issues with far-right voting, which in my member state is something of big concern. We have one of the biggest, strongest right-wing populist parties, the Freedom Party, now around 27-28% in the polls. And I found that interesting to see, and I think it's something that you said, the more inclusive policies lowers the threat perception, yeah, but it does not necessarily lower the far-right voting. And there I sort of thought, and it's not an answer to your question, but it's sort of something I thought of why that is the case. And I think it has to do, of course, a big part of these fear perceptions, yeah, threat perceptions, have to do with migration and with asylum seekers. But another part for why an increase of right-wing populist voting is being seen also has to do with the way the European Union is seen, yeah, and sort of skepticism and not really delivering in people's minds, which again for me has to do with lack of competences at European Union level in several areas, yeah, because it's always seen as the EU is not doing something, whereas it's member states preventing things to happen. Yeah? So I just wanted to add that to the debate.
Maybe, yeah, if you can just director, it's true that one of the problem is the blame game that is done at national level. When there are good things, it's us, it's the government, national government. When something doesn't work, it's the EU, of course, fault, whether we have the competence or not. I mean, clearly there are areas where we have not full competence, and that's why, I mean, we, even in the latest policy document, the European agenda, we have reasserted the need to be ambitious, but to work together with the member states to achieve common goals. I mean, we have an area without internal borders, and migration and asylum is something that has to be managed together. Now, you all follow the very difficult discussions that have taken place in the last weeks on the famous quotas of relocation of refugees, the asylum seekers. So, and the resettlement en plus, and which shows that it's a difficult issue to be discussed and to be agreed. But I think what was very important for the Commission and for President Juncker himself was to say this is not the problem of 1 or 2 or 3 member states. This is something we have to, and it's not the problem, it's a challenge that we have to address together. I mean, it's not just the frontline member states or those that have the highest number of refugees that are concerned. So I think it was very important that the Commission did that. Of course, it was somehow foreseeable that there would be difficulties, and now we will see that there will be discussions until the end of July, no holidays for many people until August this year to sort out this and to see how can we have really an approach which is based on fairness, on solidarity at European level on these issues. And I mean, I think we are quite confident that we will find a solution, not the perfect one, maybe not the one that the Commission would have wanted, but I think this was very important to tell member states, to put member states in front of their responsibility also, to say, I mean, you can't always say, you know, solidarity is good for some things, not good for others, and this is not our problem, this is... So I think that was something that politically was important to do. And we'll see how it goes, but it's very difficult, it will be difficult, and particularly on the legal migration and on labor migration, where indeed we have shared competence, we can't decide how many economic migrants we want to get. That remains always, but we have common rules, a common framework which provides for rights. So, but it remains a difficult discussion and negotiation with member states. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to continue to tell member states that we need to also have a general discourse on migration and integration, looking in the medium long term, looking at what are the demographic trends, what are the needs, what are the skills that are lacking already today, will be lacking tomorrow. So I think from the Commission we will continue to do that. Now, to come to your question, sorry, but I felt I had to say this. Coming to your questions, well, I think I have mentioned already one of the key areas where we really need to increase the synergies, and this is important for both legal migration and integration, is employment and social policies. As I have recalled now, I think in the new, in the social fund for the programming period 2014-2020, there is an obligation to use at least 20%, and there we are talking about, I think, more than 80 billion in total for the whole 7 years. So our fund is peanuts in comparison to that. So just to say that there is a great potential to use also the social fund for migration, integration and social inclusion. So 20% of the social fund needs to be devoted to social inclusion actions, which of course do not only cover migrants, but also do cover migrants and their country nationals, so that's also important. And all the policies on social inclusion, I think, are relevant also for as regards integration of migrants. Then education, of course, we don't have the colleagues from DG Education and Culture, but one of the issues, indeed, as I think you have found also, is that for migrants and third country nationals, their children, is the early dropout from school, the attainment of lower level of education, and of course this is then also a problem for future integration in the labor market, obviously. So that's certainly a very important area. Well, anti-discrimination, I think I do not even have to to explain why I think it's relevant. Both actual discrimination of migrants can have, of course, have a negative impact, but also the perception of being discriminated is also not helpful for integration. So all other things that we have mentioned, of course, family reunion, permanent residence, that we have directives on that. On other things that are also important, we have less competence, like access to nationality. It's something that indeed it's decided at national level, but it's certainly, at least the perspective of access to nationality is very relevant. So I think I will stop it here. And
yes, absolutely. I mean, you talked about the need to respond to migration with legal channels, labor migration, as a key point for developing an integration policy. And then, yes, how do you get all of these other policy areas to work together also from an integration perspective? Quite a challenge. And lastly, Isabel de Mata, maybe also what other policy areas you see are very important for health outcomes for migrants?
More or less the same that have already been mentioned. I mean, the health status depends in a big part of your genetics and biology, in a very small part of the healthcare, and in a bigger part of the environment. So, and the environment basically is the education and the money that you have. There is a lot of evidence that, for example, for overweight and obesity, especially in women, a direct relation between the education with the education. So the most educated you are, the slimmer you are. In men, it's not exactly the same. For other behaviors like alcohol, tobacco, there is also direct evidence that the poorer people have more unhealthy behaviors, not only by education, but because they don't have the means to do other things. I mean, and for example, it's very easy to say that you need to eat healthy, but just by hazard, the healthy food is more expensive than the McDonald's food. And there begins a vicious circle that you are in poor health, so you cannot work, or you can access just to temporary work, or you have a lot of instability. As you have a lot of instability, you don't have the means, you have less money. As you have less money, you have poorer health, and we begin again. So we need to break this circle, and this begins with the education in the first way, and then with the access to good employees. And also we can use, as has been mentioned, the European social funds and also the regional funds for inequalities, including inequalities in health. So we are encouraging the member state to use these funds also for health in all the areas, not only as in the past that was just to build the hospital or healthcare centers, but to fight the inequalities in health.
Thank you. I see that there are still some questions, so let me take a few questions while Zvezda is setting up for the next section. Yes, I'll say actually for our panel, if you'd like to go sit down there, you can already, but if you're addressed by a question, absolutely, you can still respond. Yeah, for a few questions. So I see Anne there. I also know that we have people on Twitter who are following through the live stream, so I'll ask Francesc if there are any 1 or 2 questions from there. So Anne, floor is yours, if you can get a microphone. Yes, for the live stream, you need the microphone.
Yes, of course. The first thing is a comment, because I hear this is something we hear very often. Sorry, my name is Anne Bathley. I'm working for ECRE, European Council on Refugees and Exile. The first thing is about the competence, which is of course true, but partially true. And at least I would say that for refugees, we know that they fare worse than migrants. I mean, of course, than nationals, than other migrants, and also in the field of employment than undocumented for diverse reasons. And I think that we need to keep in mind, and we need also, it's not, I mean, I know you know, but I think in the discourse it's important to remind that there is a competence, there is an EU competence for refugees. Because also, if we talk about a holistic approach, integration begins with reception conditions. One of the things with the lack of access to the labor market, it's also linked to the poor quality of reception conditions. So I think there are many things to do in terms of EU competence and really to push for better implementation. And it's also linked to how to mainstream integration in other areas. And there is clearly usually a distinction between asylum and integration. But I think it's also a way to mainstream. Actually, it's linked, and we need to remind member states they have obligations that have, in the asylum package, that have a clear impact on integration. The second thing is about, and this is a question, and it's about EU funding. Something I found interesting, so I don't know how you end up with this result. From our intuition, we know, but the poor impact of the open method of coordination on integration. So the soft, so actually all the tools, I'm sorry, but all the tools you mentioned, the EU Forum on Migration, the national contact points. So a first question is for researchers. I was wondering how you saw, or how you kind of evaluate the poor impact of this soft method, also called open method of coordination, on integration policies. But I wanted to also raise an issue regarding the EU funding, the use of EU funding, and I was wondering, late 2017, normally member state will have to provide a midterm review, and I really wonder what's the stage of discussion, and what do you see the role of the Commission in this midterm review? Because as far I understand, I fear that it will be a missed opportunity to actually review the priorities at national level and to look at the evaluation of this AMIF fund.
I mean, just to respond on that, on your first question about why, as a researcher, do we make those conclusions, there were 3 interesting dynamics that made us think that the impact of the soft standards has been rather uneven. First was a number of countries in the past few years have developed new integration strategies, documents, but then we were interested that there weren't changes that came in the MIPEC scores because of this. We couldn't identify any, that it led to any policy change. And then, you know, in discussion in the debates, it was clear that, well, first of all, these were strategy documents that were mostly statements of intention, but no policy commitments, and were usually done because it was required by the new Asylum, Migration, and Integration Fund. Second of all, there are a number of projects that are developed, but those are very ad hoc and don't actually constitute a policy. In comparison to a country like Portugal, that actually has developed a policy like the one-stop shops that everyone knows about, or its work on entrepreneurship, or other types of language support, which are all EU funded. but the EU funding is used in a continuous way to create a policy so that for the immigrant, actually, they get the service that they need, and it's not just about, oh, now this month we have some money, so now we're going to create something. And then the third point was that we saw that countries would make changes in legislation on things like family unification or long-term residence, but that's usually when they were targeted specifically by the European Commission or by a European Court of Justice ruling. And that then other countries that had the same requirements were not making changes. So they were not learning from what was going on because that was going on just on a bilateral basis. So that was why we were saying, well, the impact is unclear, it's here and there, and it's a process that's ongoing. I don't know if you wanted to answer on that or also on funding.
Yes, thanks. Well, you said it yourself. I mean, we have a lot of tools, and of course, soft powers are what they are. Soft powers meaning that, of course, there is a greater responsibility on member states than to develop actual policies in those areas. I mean, when we have a directive and we have legislation, we can launch infringement procedures, we can oblige member states to comply or to put in place certain legislation, to carry out inspections on this and that. But, I mean, we don't have that power in terms of integration. So, nevertheless, I mean, I wouldn't see the bottle only half empty. I would also try to see, and what I've tried to say, that there have been improvements, maybe not in all member states in the same way, with a variable, let's say, impact, including in terms of funding. But I think if this had not existed, I think we would be in a much poorer state in many member states in terms of integration. So I think we should see the two sides of the bottle. On the midterm review, I mean, I don't want to say anything incorrect, but I mean, I wouldn't be so pessimistic already. We still have a couple of years, so we intend to carry out a serious evaluation of what will be done. So I wouldn't be already pessimistic about the fact that this would be useless, this midterm review. I'll pass the message to my colleagues, but we take this very seriously. And as I said, there have been ongoing actions and to improve. Well, first the effectiveness and the evaluation of the impact of the funds, but also the synergies with other fundings, primarily the social fund, but also others, not only the social fund. So I think the world is not perfect, and what we can do is might be limited compared to other policy areas, but I wouldn't be so negative or so pessimistic on the impact that this has had. Now, on the refugee integration of refugees, I mean, you're absolutely right. Of course, we can do many things. We have an acquis very developed with rights of access to work, which is different for refugees and asylum seekers. But I mean, I think there is a renewed attention to that. I mean, from our side, we have, you might have seen it, we have just recently published a call under the AMIF, Union Actions on the Integration of Refugees, and I think it's very good that now we are no longer bound by using either the integration fund or the refugee funds. I mean, now we can combine and we can work on the integration of refugees under one single funding, which is an improvement compared to before. And also, I think on member states' side, you might be aware of the discussions that are ongoing in Germany, but also in Sweden, how to improve labor market access and integration for refugees and measures that are being taken. And even for asylum seekers, for example, in Germany, what is being discussed now, it's to give access to young asylum seekers to vocational training, in case so that if they are granting the refugee status, then they can more easily integrate into the labor market. So I think there is an awareness also because of the numbers. Let's be honest. I mean, we have had a very high number of asylum applications, a lot of refugees that have been granted protection in many member states. And of course, there is an awareness that these people will be staying in most cases, and they need to be integrated, they need to be given access to work. I mean, of course, at the beginning, you provide specific assistance where needed because these are vulnerable people, but then of course, they need to be integrated, and then the assistants need to be mainstreamed, and then they need to be full citizens, or I mean people that can contribute to the society and work and so on. So I think we are all very much aware of this, both at EU level and member states.
Okay, last little word, and then. But I really need to go. Yes, I know. Okay, well, thank you to Laura for joining us so much. Ruud, you want to say one
yes,
last
no, I just wanted to add one thing on that. As much as I also often then, if it's on yeah, that's yours. So that's yours. No, okay. as much as it's when there is European directives on infringement procedures, etc., what I find also with my national background so important when it comes to refugees is also to have the media address the examples where integration works on refugees and on asylums, on refugees and on migrants. Because very often we see that especially in areas where there are hardly any migrants or in countries where there are hardly or not very many, like even Hungary, yeah? The kind of atmosphere that is being created has to be contradicted and positive examples shown, yeah? And it's very, you address the issue of working conditions, that asylum seekers are not allowed to work, yeah? So, for example, there is a chance in my country, and I don't know about the others, that municipalities, they are allowed to have to give sort of jobs, at least for smaller ones, to asylum seekers. So that's something that at this local level should be pushed more to do, yeah, because not being able to work and not being able to earn some money yourselves is one of the essences after, I mean, having sort of healthcare and sort of having kind of not just legal status, but a kind of way of having housing, etc. But it's so important to have that as well. So I think there's lots of work to be done at not the EU level, but also at local level in order to make visible where integration also works. And I'm convinced, or I know it sometimes also helps to change some people's minds, not the racist ones and not the ones that never want any asylum seekers, but for the others, that would be extremely important.
Okay. We want to systematically gather your feedback on the recommendations if you allow us another 15, 20 minutes. So this is where I turn to Zvezda for her methods. And we will take this into account that when we revise this and publish them on the website.